Hello there, and happy Wednesday afternoon. I'm excited for this discussion tonight. We're talking about functional neurologic disorders. We're talking about autism. Is there a connection? What's the connection and why? This is a really fascinating topic to me, and I'm sure it is to you if you're curious about the brain like me. If we haven't met, my name is Julie Hirschberg. I am a neurologic physical therapist. I founded and get to run. In fact, I just got back from the clinic, which is like my favorite thing in the world. Re+active Physical Therapy and Wellness. We're an integrated neuro rehab center in the Los Angeles area, and we work a lot with people with functional neurologic disorders. I am also a professor at USC, and I love talking to my fellow clinicians, talking to people with neurologic disorders and chronic conditions. So thank you for being here. Thanks for showing up, and thanks for your amazing questions. It's honestly the questions that you all send me is what drives a lot of these live videos. And actually, we were talking about this in the lunchroom at Re+active today. We were talking about the brain, of course. We were talking about autism. We were talking about functional neurologic disorders. And I was like, we need to bring this topic back to one of our live videos because I think it is under-recognized. And honestly, I have 3 studies I want to hit on today. They're kind of the beginning, I would say, of the research in understanding the link, if there's a link between autism and functional neurologic disorder. So there's not huge randomized controlled trials on this. There's beginning understanding. And I think what is so interesting here in these research studies is that they really started by a clinician noticing that in people with functional neurologic disorders, there were quite a few people who also had autism. And they said, well, this is interesting. Why is this occurring? Does this occur outside of my clinical practice? And why, right? Why? I'm one of those incessant toddlers that's always asking why. So I'm asking why too. We see this clinically, absolutely. So when I meet when I meet a person with a functional neurologic disorder, I am definitely asking questions. If they're not diagnosed, if they're not autistic, is there any developmental history there? Are there sensory differences, sensory preferences, sensory processing changes? Have they potentially been undiagnosed? That is something our team is always looking at, and quite honestly, it's something that we do see can be a missing piece for a person, and then we can refer them for the testing and diagnosis. We don't do that testing and diagnosis ourselves at Re+active. So I want to tell you about these research studies, which, by the way, are available free full text. I will put them in our newsletter. If you're not on our newsletter, if you're a clinician, get on it, because I send out my videos and all of these resources. Basically, I've done the research for you. I put it in our newsletter every single week. If you're a clinician, sign up at reactiveeducation.com. If you are a patient or a family member or friend of a person with a neurologic disorder, sign up at reactivept.com. I will put all of these articles in there. The first article that really caught my eye, I think this was from 2022. It's from a group. I'm sorry. This was just this year, 2023. This is not the first article. This is maybe the second article that caught my eye. It's called Autism Spectrum Disorder May Be Highly Prevalent in People with Functional Neurologic Disorder. The first author is Gonzalez Herrero, is the last name. This person is out of the UK, as well as the other researchers on this paper. So what they looked at was actually surveying people with functional neurologic disorders, and they used the FND HOPE group, which is, by the way, hands down, fabulous nonprofit working with people with functional neurologic disorders, FND Hope. So they did a survey to survey folks with FND and screen for autistic traits. Of course, there's pros and cons to doing that. There's limitations. But what they found, they had 344 people respond to this survey. 8% of those people had a previous diagnosis of autism. 24% had a first degree relative of a person with autism as well. And they found, however, in using the screening tool, they used the adult autism sub-threshold spectrum measure. So using the screening tool, they found that 69% of respondents with FND had scores indicating a potential diagnosis of autism. Not a definitive diagnosis. This is a screening tool and it's totally self-reported. But 69% of them had this, and 21% of them had autistic traits. So they really asked that question then, is it possible that autism is more prevalent in FND? And according to those statistics, that is indeed a higher number than you might see in healthy adults. And what I find most interesting, and I think this is what drives and drove me to want to understand this better, is I'm very interested in autism and the developing brain and understanding neurodivergence and how the brain might work when things are connected differently than in a neurotypical person. And those things that are connected differently in autism also are very similar in FND. So the ability to experience self-agency. This is something that you can find in an autistic person as well as a person with FND. Difficulty with interoception, that sensory perception of what's going on internally in the body. You see that in autism, you see it in functional neurologic disorders. Also, difficulty in perceiving nuances in emotional states, which can be also a part of interoception. You see that in functional neurologic disorders, you see it in autism. And that's what the authors talk about as well. And we see these things. So what I would say, and that the authors talk about this as well, is a person with autism potentially, because of the way their brain is already connected, maybe at risk for developing a functional neurologic disorder? And I would say, especially if their sensory needs aren't met, especially if they're not getting good sensory feedback from their body, which we know and understand can be a component of autism. And then how can we actually build and support a person with autism, build up their ability to meet their sensory needs, ability to meet their body and movement needs, to prevent this from occurring. That, I see people with functional neurologic disorders all of the time. You got to believe I want to help prevent it from occurring. Just like I would say I want to help prevent stroke, or help prevent spinal cord injuries from occurring, or brain injuries or concussion. I would rather not have those things happen. And if it is the case that the way the brain is wired in autism could potentially predispose somebody to a functional neurologic disorder, well, heck, we should do something about that and help support people with autism to have their needs met. Great comment. Thank you for sharing. This is Tempted Spirit. I love that name. I have both autism and FND. This is good to know. Thank you for sharing that. And I have to tell you, you are absolutely not alone. We should publish this, because I should look at the numbers in a little more detail. But I would tell you it's probably at least 40% of the people that we see with autism, with FND, also have autism. And honestly, it doesn't surprise me. The sensory processing differences, the sensory integration, the interoception, like I mentioned, go hand in hand. And I wish I could share a visual with you. But there's a really wonderful article on FND that is written by Mark Hallett and colleagues. You know what? I'll put a link in our newsletter because it's so good. It's one of my absolute favorites. And it actually goes through how we generate movement and control movement based on predictions and also based on feedback. And every step of that pathway, a person with autism has difficulty initiating the movement, getting the correct sensory feedback from the body because of proprioceptive differences or sensory integration difficulties. And so that can cause, when you don't have the correct feedback to the brain, so we're generating movement, we're getting sensory feedback, when you don't have the correct feedback, the brain will actually generate and predict movement that is abnormal. So again, that's why it's not surprising that you can see these things together, and we see them all of the time. So another piece, so this is another article. Last name of this author is Nistisio. I probably mispronounced it. This is a group out of Italy, and I actually met this group at the Functional Neurological Disorder Society meeting 2 years ago in the summer, and they presented this in a poster, and it has since been published in 2022, and they have a couple of papers, and we'll probably have more. I think they have just as much curiosity about this as I do, and they're doing the research, so I'm so thankful. This particular paper from Frontiers in Psychiatry in 2022 was called Hypermobile Spectrum Disorder, Symptoms in Patients with Functional Neurologic Disorders and Autism Spectrum Disorders, a Preliminary Study. Now, this one had all of the things in the title. When I saw this come out, I was like, I've got to read this, because this is another thing that we see clinically. So we do know there's a higher prevalence of hypermobility in an autistic person in the population of people with autism. So we know those go hand in hand. We also know that hypermobility can be a comorbid condition with functional neurologic disorder. So are all of those pieces related? I would say absolutely yes, because we also know that hypermobility can lead to poor sensory feedback from the body. Proprioceptive changes absolutely occurs. We also know that with hypermobility, there can be autonomic changes, and those can also drive functional neurologic disorder symptoms. So not surprising to see these all together, but whenever I see something clinically that I've gone, I wonder if these things are related. And then I see that somebody else is curious about this too, and they're doing research. I'm just thrilled. So this group is doing this. What they found in this particular study, so they had, I love to give you the numbers here, 20 patients with functional neurologic disorders, 27 autistic people, and 26 neurotypical people. And they looked at they screened for hypermobility. What they found is that 55% of the patients with functional neurologic disorders had hypermobility. 44% of the people with autism had hypermobility. And actually, 30% of the neurotypical folks, based on their screening measure, again, that's not 100, it might not be the best tool is what I was trying to say there. But even 30% of the neurotypical also reached the cutoff score for hypermobility. So what does this tell us? It tells us that hypermobility is common throughout the population. It used to be thought of as kind of a rare disorder. It's not. Hello, we as physical therapists should be screening this in everybody all of the time and incorporating it into treatment. We should not go blindly into this. And I will tell you, if you would have asked me when I started Re+active 12 years ago, I wasn't screening for hypermobility. I didn't really know it was a thing outside of, I would say, like, I always screened for it in like gymnasts and dancers because it could lead to a lot of injuries. But that's beside the point. I wasn't screening for it in neurologic disorders, and we should be screening everybody for this. It's very common. The other thing is that then we can get this overlap, right, of functional neurologic disorders, autism, and hypermobility. And, now we really have kind of a trifecta of symptoms likely driven, and this is where I would say the functional neurologic disorder is likely driven by the underlying sensory movement, even executive function and autonomic changes that are occurring in the autism and in hypermobility disorders. And what I think the biggest take home for me as a clinician, and this is my message to you, my fellow clinicians as well, is you need to screen for these. You need to include this into your treatment plan, meaning you should, number one, my practice, neurodiversity affirming practice. We're not treating autism. We're not trying to take it away. In fact, I think it's actually a very important piece of a person's identity. We're not taking it away. We are supporting it. We are accommodating it. And particularly, we're understanding the person's sensory needs, their autonomic needs, the needs of their body. We're supporting them so that they can get accurate feedback and therefore be able to produce and control and regain a sense of agency over their movement. That's what I mean when we're considering into treatment. We're not treating autism. Same with hypermobility. We're not taking hypermobility away from a person. We're supporting it. So we're strengthening for that person. We're providing proprioceptive supports. We might even provide bracing and other devices to support that person. Because they have hypermobility and they need it, right? And a person with hypermobility can do really well with the right therapy and supports. So those are key takeaways from that particular article. Now I have one more, same first author, and this is the first study that got me super interested. This is the study that they brought to the FND Society a year and a half ago. This is from the journal Neurological Sciences 2022, Clinical Overlap Between Functional Neurologic Disorders and Autism Spectrum Disorders, a preliminary study. And again, this was out of Italy. And in this study, they had a sample of 21 people with functional neurologic disorders, 30 autistic folks, and 45 neurotypical adults. And what they had them do was screening tools looking at let me give you the actual screening, the autism quotient, the Ritvo Autism Asperger Diagnostic Scale, revised, it's the RADS, and then a symptom scale for functional neurologic symptoms. They also, love this, had them complete the sensory perception quotient so that they could look at sensory perception. What they found in the functional neurologic disorder group, they found that 19% of those scored above the cutoff for autism, And that was actually similar. It was a little bit higher than the neurotypical group. So not necessarily that autism was more common in the group with functional neurologic disorders, but they found that 86.7% of the autistic group had at least one functional neurologic disorder symptom. This is definitely higher than what they found in the neurotypical group. But listen to this. The neurotypical group had 35% of them also had a functional neurologic symptom. I think what we need to acknowledge is that functional neurologic symptoms are common. That's one of the take-homes. But that functional neurologic symptoms are even more common in autistic folks. And they also found, I thought this was so interesting, is tactile hypersensitivity. So they measured this on, let me see what it was called again, the sensory perception quotient. So tactile hypersensitivity was a risk factor for functional weakness in folks with autism. That is so interesting because clinically we see a relationship very often between what a person reports sensory wise, whether that's a hypersensitivity or a low registration, and their movement symptoms like a functional weakness. So again, they found that this tactile hypersensitivity was a risk factor for functional weakness in people with autism. So fascinating. Because then what I think, again, is can we intervene? Can we provide and support that person's sensory system so that they might not develop functional weakness? The other thing I would say is, can we intervene on a sensory level so that we can improve their functional weakness? Now, I will say clinically, absolutely we can, because I see it all the time. But this study gives us some preliminary evidence, at least of a relationship there. And I think that is so fascinating. Now, something else, and I'm just going to read this from their article, is kind of why might this occur? And this is what I talked about the predictions of the brain and then the inaccurate sensory feedback that a person with autism might be getting because of their sensory differences. So in the discussion, they say the bottom up information, meaning that sensory feedback, might deviate from the prediction or the expectation. And this leads to a larger predictive error. And so, if your brain is constantly getting a very large predictive error, hang with me, this is a little complicated, but if your brain is getting this large predictive error, it may actually produce a functional sensory change, a difference, a paresthesia, to compensate for that. And I thought this was so fascinating because I kind of wondered this. And so they're not proving this. They're also just wondering this. But hey, this group in Italy is wondering the same thing that I am. Does the brain actually produce this sensory difference to make up for the prediction error because the sensory feedback is inaccurate? And therefore, the best thing that we can do for for folks where we find this is to actually improve the sensory feedback. Sometimes they need more, sometimes less. Sometimes sensory information, they need more vestibular or more proprioceptive or more light touch or more sound. It differs for each person, right? It's not the same. No two people with autism are the same. No two people with FND are the same. We need to test those out and treat it. So there you have it. 3 studies. They're preliminary studies. They're not definitive studies. They're not randomized controlled trials, but I will say they did look at and compare different groups together. It's a start, but they're preliminary studies that are finding that there could be some links between autism and FND. Particularly, it looks like it's more common, and potentially these brain regions involved are similar. So I want to get to a couple of comments here. Little Bug 69. I love that name. I have so much trouble understanding the why for FND treatments. My boss has told me to prove to the person's brain and the body that they can do hard things. I do a lot of dual tasking. My boss also told me not to bring too much attention while giving feedback to the deficits because of the tendency to ruminate. So those are interesting thoughts. And I guess, sticking with this theme of sensory feedback, I'm not sure I'm 100% agreeing with those things, and I don't disagree either. I think there might be cases where that is the case, where we might need to help somebody experience something that's really challenging and give them success with that, especially if there's been a lot of fear, like they've fallen, that they've hurt themselves. That, that idea kind of the brain doing hard things, that's like a building confidence type of piece. I do see that in some people. Not all of them. The other thing too is the attention. So we do know in functional neurologic disorders that part of the brain with heavy attention to sometimes the very minute details of movement actually really can make symptoms worse, because it's kind of hijacking the brain from driving automatic movement. So that attentional center to very particular ways you're moving, or muscles that are firing, or the sensations that are coming in, that can actually hijack automatic movement. So you are right that that cueing the person to an externally focused goal, meaning, if I'm trying to get arm movement, I'm not just going to say, raise your arm up like this. I'm going to say, touch this today. I was working with another therapist, touch this blaze pod up here, and we're going to do it to music. That is an externally focused goal. That helps orient the brain to goal-oriented movement versus internally focused movement. And that can be, not all of the time, by the way, but can be very helpful in a functional neurologic disorders. One of the things, now I will say, I don't do that because a person ruminates. Now, a person might ruminate. But the reason I'm doing an externally goal-focused intervention is not for rumination. It's to unlock movement, because that's how movement is organized. So I think, if the person is ruminating, if the person's really preoccupied with their movement, first of all, that's totally normal. Wouldn't you be preoccupied with your movement if you were tremoring all the time, or if you had dystonia? I think that's totally normal to ruminate about those things. Our goal in physical therapy is not just to distract from rumination or even to try to get rid of rumination. That's not the goal. We may try to understand why that person is stuck there. Actually, I think it makes a lot of sense. I'd be stuck there too, ruminating. And what we would really want to do is to work to help that person identify other roles and activities to engage in that bring them out of that state of constant surveillance. The state of constant surveillance makes sense to me. If you've had any kind of injury, if you've had any kind of abnormal movement, it totally makes sense. And part of the treatment is to re-engage, to find safety in the body. So that would be the thing that I would say if we're trying to help somebody that is stuck in a spiral of, fear and rumination. Acknowledge it. It's totally normal. And also provide them safety within your experience of therapy so that they can experience a moment of success. They can experience confidence in movement again. We're not just trying to get rid of those things. So what a great comment. And I just want to say thank you to Littlebug69 because you're saying and asking the things that every therapist that I talk to asks about. So look at your curiosity and your interest in this. I just love this. So also this person is asking, how would you do a sensory profile without doing the prior? I'm not totally sure what that means, but I would do a sensory profile at any point in the continuum of care for that person to try to understand what their sensory system is set up like. Now, I want to do a sensory profile, but I also want to test all of the sensory systems. You need to follow up. Like the sensory profile tells us kind of the general organization, but not the why. We need to get at the why, right? Is it vestibular, proprioceptive? What are the pieces that this person needs? Such a great question. And thank you so much for asking the hard questions. So again, I'm putting these articles. So our focus today was on autism and functional neurologic disorders. There's some preliminary articles that are looking at the relationships between those. We talked about the sensory systems. We talked about hypermobility, the way even the motor systems are organized. I think my dog's one in on this. So I am going to put this video in our newsletter. I am going to put these articles. They're all free full text. I'm going to put these in our newsletter. If you're a clinician, sign up at reactiveeducation.com. If you are a patient, a family member, an interested and curious person like me, sign up on reactivept.com. I'll send out the newsletter, get on it, and thank you. Thank you for your curiosity, your interest in this. And I'm going to answer one more question because it came up here before I get off. So any advice for autism and functional tics? I've been thinking about this one actually. We see a lot of folks with functional tics. Functional tics can look very much like a Tourette syndrome tic, but they do have their own distinct characteristics. It is something that we see commonly. And I'm going to tell you that there's not research on this. But we do understand functional tics or functional dystonia or functional myoclonus. All of those fall into the realm of movement disorders that's called hyperkinetic, meaning extra movement, uncontrolled movement. And that's very different than hypokinetic, meaning less movement or slow movement. So tics fall into that category. And typically when we see a functional neurologic disorder that includes excessive movement, and you're asking about autism as well, which, by the way, I can't provide medical advice here. I don't know your case particularly, but I'm going to tell you how I might approach it and how I would say you could advocate for your therapist to approach it too. I'd look at the sensory system because we understand sensory processing might be different. in a person that's autistic. We understand that there might be some challenges proprioceptive wise, vestibular wise. I would test those because it may be that the tic and the excessive movement or vocalization or however it presents may actually be because the brain is not getting the correct feedback from the body sensory wise. So we can't just change the tic without, the sensory and motor systems are intricately intertwined. So I would test that out. I'd want to understand what might be the underlying sensory piece. And I would also be very curious. So in the world of autism, a lot of folks that are autistic stim. It's called stimming. So what we often will see is movements of the hands, movements of the body, lots of movements, and it's very regulating to the nervous system. We should not stop people from stimming at all. And one of the things that I would say is it's not helpful to suppress, honestly, any functional neurologic disorder, but tic, excessive movement, it's not helpful to hide it, mask it, or suppress it. And I say this especially in autism. Now, it doesn't mean we can't actually help reintegrate and improve the motor control there. We absolutely can. I would say, you know what? It might be 100%, but I don't know. Again, I need to publish this research, but a lot of the folks that we see with functional tics, they completely go away because we're addressing the underlying pieces, whether that's sensory or autonomic or motor control. So test those systems, treat the underlying pieces, but don't suppress, right? So suppression usually makes it worse. So if you have the ability to suppress the tic or suppress your dystonia, it usually actually causes the nervous system to just kind of overflow in a massive amount of movement sometimes. So we actually want to find what movement does your body need and how can you do that in a really regulating way throughout the day. It might be moving up and down. You might need odorless stimulation. You might need rocking back and forth. It's variable. It's so different for every single person. But you want to discover that alongside a therapist and incorporated that into treatment. And typically what I see when a person has functional tics is as they improve nervous system regulation, as they get the movement and sensory supports and input that they need throughout the day, they go away. So that's kind of the simple version for a wonderful question. So thank you so much for asking it. Thanks for asking these great questions again and for your interest. I'll put this on the newsletter. So sign up, clinicians, reactiveeducation.com. If you're a patient, reactivept.com. And we'll see you again soon. And look at Tempted Spirit, writing this all for my therapist. Brilliant. You could send them our newsletter. So awesome for you advocating for yourself, for your therapist, for your needs. I think it's going to take you far. So thank you all so very much. I will see you next time. Have a great night.